To understand what Nick Fuentes and the Groypers want out of the Republican Party, we need to understand two political ideas that background all of their political strategy: accelerationism and political hegemony. My last video explained the relationship between the Groypers, Nick Fuentes, and Charlie Kirk. Let's now go into their motivations, starting with the most important thing to understand when we have a discussion about political concepts, that wherever they originate from, that doesn't mean that's the only ideology that can use them. Most of the time, other ideologies pick up these things like political tools, as in like a hammer or a saw would be used in a workshop, and convert them to their own ends. And this very much is the same in both of these cases. Now, originally accelerationism comes out of the late 1960s, 1970s French post-left culture, but it is picked up much later by a British man named Nick Land. Nick is a lot of things, including a eugenicist and a race scientist, but for today we are going to talk about him as the originator of the Dark Enlightenment philosophy, which has attached itself to such wonderful figures as J.D. Vance and Peter Thiel, the CEO of Palantir, and major funder of the MAGA movement. Nick Land concerned himself with figuring out how to seize power back from the leftists and liberals that he saw as dominating the world, and he thought of how to do this through incredibly violent means, including trying to figure out how you could trigger the collapse of the current system. Right-wing accelerationism, which they will try to organize to overthrow in a violent manner very rapidly the existing order. For many people in Nick's orbit and his ideological descendants, the idea is to how to trigger a race war, or a final confrontation with all of their perceived political enemies. I think you need to understand, I'm not talking just about the mass deportations, which are horrible in their own right, or the massive amounts of deportation camps that Trump continues to build. No, we're talking about a step further than that. Nick wants to reach extermination camps. This is why the Groypers are at war with Donald Trump. They don't see him going far enough. They see his use at an end. They see him as an old man who only has a few more years left in him. And right now, the Republican Party is about to shift in a big way. And who gets to be the successor to Donald Trump is the big question at hand. And that doesn't mean that Nick becomes the guy, but his Groyper movement could be in every little part of it, like an octopus scriggling around its tentacles into every aspect of the grand old party. And for many people, this is very hard to understand because you're not very educated in how ideologies have massive amounts of different tendencies below them. Words like fascism represent dozens and dozens of different political tendencies that have their own little splits and sects in between them. And that's before we ever get to any of them being organized into actual movements and parties. And just like even a small friend group might have different people taking different sides, that happens in large organizations like political parties. And in countries like the United States, where so few people actually participate in politics on a day-to-day basis, and so few people take part in party politics, it is very easy for motivated people like Nick Fuentes or the MAGA movement itself to seize control of a political party with money, backing, and people. Which leads us to our next concept, political hegemony theory. This idea was created by Italian communist leader Antonio Gramsci while he was imprisoned by Mussolini's fascist Italy. Gramsci was trying to understand how the fascists were able to seize power and take control of the working class, and the common understanding of history as understood by Marxists were that the working class would achieve class consciousness and thus naturally move towards a socialist and communist direction. Gramsci realized that actually it was culture and control of institutions that were able to determine what politics would take control in a place, meaning that who controlled the media, who controlled the churches, who controlled the ability to speak, were able to shift the ideas of the people below them, slowly but surely. That fundamentally, culture is upstream from politics. This is why movements like the MAGA movement have been so aggressive against going after leftist and liberal culture, because they understand this is where the power lies. This is also why they attack the education system. Whereas Gramsci thought of these as institutions to help people achieve class consciousness and enlighten themselves so that they could build a better and more democratic world, the fascists realize that control of these institutions can also solidify fascist understanding. And that's what Nick Fuentes and the Groypers want out of the Republican Party. They want to shift the culture of the party further and further into their direction. The Groyper beliefs that are steeped in Catholic integralism, the fascism of Italy, and neo-Nazism is all wrapped up in an ironic and humorous behavior of meme culture and brain rot. We have to understand that these movements are not isolated from one another. Nick is networked around the world just in the same way that Charlie Kirk was. These youth movements cross borders, and so does the content being produced by them. Their actions have a real effect on day-to-day politics and the actual governance of major political parties in the world. One of the scariest parts is Nick Fuentes' group and the Groypers, they're not even the furthest right you can go. After that, we start to get to the extreme right that has completely foregone elections. This is where we get our nihilist extremist groups that are going out there just trying to trigger accelerationism through acts of terrorism and extreme violence. These groups are active all over the world, constantly recruiting. My advice to parents are make sure that you open up lines of communication and you understand and ask, not in a threatening way, what your children are up to on the internet. Understand their culture and where they're at. Let them communicate with you, and you make the effort to understand what they are saying. A bigger way, as a society, we need to put a lot more resources into youth programs, education, and funding. Not only that, it's also important to teach democracy to your children and teach it to yourself, because otherwise they are prey to ideologies that are built on getting people young and pulling them into the most extreme behavior. Nick was 15 when he started popping off on the internet, and he's not even 30 yet. Can you imagine where he's gonna be in 10 years? And he has proven extra resilient, being kicked off of every single mainstream platform, of course except for X, who he was led on personally backed by Elon Musk. But that's the game, to set up alternative spaces, to preach your hate, and make sure that you're always present and slowly pulling people out of mainstream spaces into your spaces. This is why Nick runs a competing conference to CPAC. This is why Nick runs a competing organization to Turning Point USA. This is why he runs a competing think tank, because you are trying to create an alternative culture that people can walk right into. And in a time that neoliberal economics has really destroyed the civil society in many countries and sapped all the money out of both public spaces but also public programs, it is time to reinvest in our communities and in our young people. It is time to get politically active and get involved in your democracy, in party politics, community organizations, and trade unions. And it is important that this is done at a young age. Trump is very old. He only has so many years left. And whatever happens with the Republican Party after, if there is a Republican Party, will be even more extreme in the secession wars that will no doubt take place. Thank you for watching. Please donate and do some engagements. Thanks a bunch.